Yeah.
Well, welcome everyone for what is our 17th, can you believe it, our 17th online talk. It all started last summer when I thought, how do I keep you all entertained and myself entertained? And we've been from big cats of Latin America to Ronnie Biggs traipsing through Brazil. And I keep thinking this is going to be the last one because it never is. I'm really looking forward to today's talk. Peter Pyne is going to talk to us from Northern Ireland. Now we've got sound working, where he lives in Derry. Peter's a historian. I think, Peter, you were put in touch with me via Susan Wilkinson, who gave one of our earlier talks on the Welsh in Patagonia and the mimosa. Peter spent most of his life as a historian, mainly at Ulster University. But he runs a B&B, or has run a B&B in Derry for some years now. And I suspect as a way of escaping from the B&B, he started researching the Panama Railroad. But I'm sure he'll tell us more about that. And this is also timely because Peter has just published a book, which I gather is the first ever comprehensive account of the railroad. And I was reading one of the reviews of it, which said it will become the standard reference work, compelling and well written. So you can't get fairer than that. So without further ado, Peter, I'll hand over to you. You take over the words, and whenever you need me to change a slide, just tell me.
Okay. Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. Most people today associate the Panama with the canal that runs from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but very few know that the railway preceded the canal by about 50 years. This short railway, less than 50 miles long, is still in existence, and it's unique in a number of ways. It was the world's first interoceanic railroad, the first to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This was before the one across the United States, about 15 years earlier than the American one. It was the first railway to be built in Central America. It was one of the great engineering achievements of the mid-Victorian era. It was the most expensive railway to be built anywhere in the world in terms of cost per mile for most, if not all, of the 19th century. It was also the highest priced train journey in the world in terms of the ticket cost per mile. Without the aid of this railway, the Panama Canal could not have been built. And the story of how it was built and the thousands of men who struggled through the swamps and the jungle of Panama to complete it deserves to be more widely known. Now, why was a railroad built across Panama in the 1850s in the first place? Well, in 1847, a wealthy New York ship owner by the name of William Aspinwall, there's his picture, he came up with the idea of a radically new transportation system that would link the east and west coasts of the US. He proposed building a railroad across Panama, which would act as a land bridge, with steamships connecting at either end on the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Passengers and freight could then be speedily transported to and from the new Western American territories of California and Oregon. America was still expanding to the west at this stage. Aspinwall's first step was to secure a concession from the government of New Granada to build his railroad. Now, you might wonder, what's New Granada? Well, at that time, in the 1850s, Panama was a province of the country called New Granada, a country which we now know as Colombia. The name changed later in the 19th century. Once he had secured his concession, Aspinwall formally established the Panama Railroad Company in New York. He and his associates also founded the Pacific Mail Steamship Company to operate paddle steamers between Panama and San Francisco. So that was the other leg of the trip. Although Aspinwall didn't realize it at the time, his timing was perfect. He'd started to implement his transport plan just before news of the California gold rush reached America's East Coast at the end of 1848. Gold was discovered at the beginning of 1848, but the news didn't get across to the East Coast until the end of the year. From 1849 onwards, the discovery of gold in California set off a huge tidal wave of migration. Everybody wanted to get rich quick. They thought gold was there. It was just, you just had to pick it up. So settlers and gold seekers from the US, and in fact, many other countries in the world, flocked to the new American territories on the Pacific coast. They were sometimes known as 49ers from the number of them that migrated in 1849. Could we have a look now at the map of Central America? Yeah. Now there were three ways of. You'll see Panama at the bottom of the map here, and New Granada, and there were three ways for people to get to California and Oregon at this time. One of the sayings was the Horn around, the plains across, or the isthmus over. Now the Horn around was Cape Horn, so people could sail from New York or eastern ports all the way down to the end of South America and then back up on the Pacific side to San Francisco. That was a journey of about 13,000 miles, and it could take between 4 and 6 months by sailing ship. So it was a slow and rather tedious journey to get to California. The second route was the plains across. That's to head just across the United States by wagon train. Now, that could only be done in the summer months because snows on the Rocky Mountains closed the passes, and you couldn't travel all year round by wagon train. Also, there was the possibility of hostile Indian tribes who weren't too happy about all these migrants crossing over their plains. The third alternative was to cross the Isthmus of Panama. Now, an isthmus is it's a geographical term. It's a long or a thin strip of earth or ground that links two other larger land masses. In this case, Panama links South America and North America. Now, travel via the Isthmus of Panama was the fastest route to California, but crossing Panama was uncomfortable, expensive, and often dangerous to the health of the travelers. Perhaps we could have a look at the map of the Panama Railroad route. Yeah, so the journey for migrants heading to California or Oregon via Panama was a sort of a hop, step, and jump process. First of all, they traveled to Panama's Caribbean coast to a place, you'll see it at the top left-hand corner, Chagres, a port called Chagres near Fort San Lorenzo. Then they traveled up the Chagres River as far as a town called Cruces, which you may see somewhere slightly over halfway across Panama. That's as far as the canoes could get up, or small craft could get up the Chagres River. And then from Cruces, they had to travel by land, either walk to Panama City or ride on muleback. It was a distance of about 20 odd miles. Then from Panama City, which was the only major town in the province, from Panama City, they would have to wait for a ship which would then take them northwards up the Pacific to San Francisco or wherever else they were going. So the entire trip took about 6 weeks if all went well, but it often took much longer. So I'll go back then to the start of construction. In late 1849, the railroad company appointed 2 American engineers by the name of George Totten and John Troutwine as contractors to build the railroad. Now, they started construction at a town just over halfway across the isthmus. The town, you'll see it roughly in the middle here, it's called Gorgona. And the idea was to build the first leg from Gorgona to Panama City, and then subsequently the second leg from Gorgona up to the Atlantic. However, Totten and Troutwine soon ran into serious difficulties, and they had to abandon their contract after a few months. As we should see, this pattern of unexpected obstacles and delays was to be repeated throughout the period of construction. The Panama Railroad Company then assumed direct responsibility for building the railroad, retaining Totten and Troutwine as salaried engineers. They now switched construction to Manzanillo Island, just off the Caribbean coast. So if you look again up to the top of the map, you'll see Manzanillo Island near a place called Colon, which was then known as Aspinwall, but I'll come back to that later on. And now Manzanillo Island became the Atlantic terminus of the railroad. Work started here in May 1850, but new problems soon arose. It was a very unhealthy place in which to start building a railroad. The island was barely above sea level, and it was several hundred yards off the shore. The surrounding coastal area was low-lying, and the tracks would have to cross miles of mangrove swamps before reaching firm ground further inland. Men often had to work up to their waists in water infested with poisonous snakes and large crocodiles. So we'll have a look now at a slide of the mangrove swamps. Now, I don't have there are no photographs that I know of the building of the railroad. So what I've done is looked at contemporary illustrations in books about Panama to supply the missing photographs. So this is an idea, give you an idea of the sort of swamps and the mangroves that they initially had to go through. The first maybe 8 or 10 miles was through swampy territory of this kind. The engineers and the workers also had to contend with tropical downpours, which drench Panama for about 8 months of the year. They get heavy monsoon-like weather from about April to December. Mosquitoes, sandflies, and all sorts of nasty insects abounded, and malaria and other tropical diseases were endemic. Not surprisingly, laborers deserted in droves, seeking easier and better paid employment elsewhere. A discouraged Troutwine resigned at the end of 1850 and returned to the US, leaving Totten in sole charge. Construction dragged on slowly during 1851. By October of that year, close to 2 years after the project had begun, only 7 or 8 miles of track had been laid, most of it on piles driven into the swamps, and the company had exhausted much of its capital. We'll have a look now at another slide, virgin forest. This was once they got through the swamps. This is the sort of rainforest or jungle that they had to clear and lay the tracks on. A disillusioned Totten recommended that the company should hand over project to an outside contractor. He wasn't making the kind of progress he had hoped. The company accepted his advice, and in June 1852, an American railroad builder called Minor Story assumed responsibility for completing the project in just over a year, by August 1853. But Story, however, made even slower progress in the course of the following year. He had 2 strokes of bad luck. In 1852, there was an outbreak of cholera in Panama, and the following year, yellow fever was an epidemic of yellow fever, and that depleted his workforce. Also, he'd almost completed a huge wooden bridge, more than 600 feet long, over the Chagres River, when a sudden flood in April 1853 destroyed it. Chagres was notorious for sudden rises in depth and in the size of the flow when there was heavy rain in the mountains. Yeah, now we look at the primeval forest. This will give you another example, illustration of what it was like for the men to clear the ground. And remember, they had no mechanical instruments, no chainsaws, so they had huge trees, some of which were 30 feet in circumference and over 100 feet high. They had to be chopped down or sawed down by hand, and the ground leveled. So slow work. Now, as a result of Story's failure, the Panama Railroad Company decided to again take over responsibility for completing the line, once again under the leadership of the chief engineer, George Totten. By this stage, we're now at September 1853. Over 3.5 years had passed since the project had started, and less than 30 miles of track had been laid. A new threat to the railroad now emerged. An alternative route to the American West via the Central American Republic of Nicaragua was attracting a growing number of travelers. So I wonder, could we see the map of Central America again? Yeah, you'll see Nicaragua is somewhat to the north. There's Panama, then there's Costa Rica, and then Nicaragua. Now, the Nicaragua route to the American West was promoted by Cornelius Vanderbilt, a millionaire shipping tycoon and a rival to Aspinwall. Now, his ships brought migrants and gold seekers to Nicaragua, came down the east coast of the United States, landed at San Juan del Norte in Nicaragua, and then traveled by river and lake across Nicaragua to San Juan del Sur on the other side, on the Pacific side, and then they caught a ship, one of his ships, up to California. Because Nicaragua was closer to the US than Panama was, Vanderbilt's route was slightly faster. So it was a little bit quicker. So this greatly worried the Panama Railroad Company. So they responded to this competition by speeding up construction. They poured large numbers of laborers into the project from middle of 1853 onwards. These men came from China, Jamaica, Ireland, the United States, as well as New Granada and some of the Central American countries. The result was that by the end of 1854, between 5,000 and 7,000 men were hacking and digging their way through Panama's forests and hills. And finally, at midnight on January the 27th, 1855, just over 5 years after construction had started, the final rails were laid. And for the first time in history, trains could now connect 2 of the world's great oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. Say something now about the workers. Who were they? How many of them were they? And where did they come from? Well, We don't have any definitive answer as to the number of men employed during the course of construction because the records are not there. But it's likely that about 17,500 men worked on this project between 1850 and 1855, not all at once, but they, as I'll explain later, they were recruited for short contracts. Now, these men came from four main sources. The biggest number, about 7,000, were Spanish speaking, and they came from New Granada. That's the country down to the south of Panama, and from adjoining Central American republics. Then another 6,000 white men were hired in the US. I believe that many of these men, possibly 60% of them, were Irish immigrants who were engaged in construction in the US, building railways and canals. About 3,000 workers came from the West Indies, mainly from Jamaica. It's not on the map here, it's just off the map, but it's not very far away from Panama. And then about 1,000 Chinese, or just over 1,000 Chinese indentured laborers were imported directly from southern China, over 700 of them in a ship called the Sea Witch. So we'll have a look at the Sea Witch. Yeah, there we are. The Sea Witch was a clipper ship owned by Aspinwall, and it was originally designed, was a new kind of ship to bring tea from China to the United States in the shortest time possible. And this ship, in fact, held the record. It did the trip from, I think it may have been Hong Kong to New York in 88 days, which was quite a record. It had to sail around Cape Horn. So this was a clipper ship, and it brought about 700 Chinese directly to Panama. In addition to these, to the ones I've already mentioned, a few hundred workers came from the Indian subcontinent and the Malay Peninsula. These were people that had been working in Jamaica. Finally, 360 men were recruited in Cork and shipped directly from Ireland to Panama. And I'll talk a little more about them shortly. The Panama Railroad was therefore an early example of a multi-ethnic and a multilingual workforce in the Victorian era. The construction force was exclusively male. However, laborers that came from the nearby Cartagena region in New Granada and from Jamaica were sometimes accompanied by their womenfolk. But white men from the US were not accompanied by women or families during the construction period. Later on, officials in the railroad were able to bring family members down, but not in the early days. Now say something about the men from Cork. The shipment of men from Cork in the south of Ireland to work on the railroad aroused my particular interest, and I'll now say a few words about them. The railroad sent its vice president, a man called Colonel Alexander Center. He had been in the US military, to Ireland towards the end of 1853 as part of its attempt to recruit more manpower to build the railway. The company contacted Irish workhouses to see if they were interested in getting rid of some of their male inmates by sending them to Panama. Now, Irish workhouses at this stage were still crowded with thousands of destitute survivors of the disastrous Great Famine of 1845-51. However, the workhouse in Cork City was the only one to respond to the railroad's overtures. The company hoped to recruit 1,000 or so labourers, masons and quarrymen from the Cork workhouse and from workers in the city and the surrounding region. Press advertisements in local newspapers sought men for a 6-month period with a guaranteed free trip by steamer from Panama to New Orleans or New York at the end of their contract. Center, the company's vice president, chartered a large sailing vessel in Liverpool called the Ben Nevis to take his Irish recruits to Panama. So we'll have a look at the slide now of the Ben Nevis. Ben Nevis was a sizable ship by the standards of the time. It had been built for the immigrant trade to Australia. It was one of the early ships taking settlers from Britain to Australia. Centre was surprised to find that unfavourable reports from Irishmen who had previously worked on the railroad had filtered back to Ireland. He'd assumed that nobody in Ireland knew very much or knew anything about the Panama Railroad. And scathing accounts of conditions in Panama appeared in Cork's newspapers, and this undermined his attempts to recruit the 1,000 men he needed. When the Ben Nevis sailing ship finally left Cork on a foggy morning in December 1853, it was less than half full. A total of 360 men were on board, 133 inmates from the Cork workhouse, together with another 230 men from the city and other parts of the country. Using the workhouse records, I was able to find the names and details of the inmates from the workhouse who had volunteered for Panama. About 2/3 of them were young single men between 14 and 20 years old. And I imagine they were desperate to escape from the grim conditions in the workhouse and attracted by the promise of a free ticket to the US once their contract was up. Now I'd like to say something about the working conditions of the labourers on the railway. Most of the employees signed on for a period of 6 months. Labourers were paid $1 per day with small variations depending on ethnicity. There wasn't a great deal of difference between what the Jamaican men earned or the Irish or the people from New Granada. The Chinese were the only exception. They were indentured workers. They were paid only $4 per month. Food, accommodation, and travel costs for all employees were paid for by the company. The working day lasted an exhausting 12 hours from sunrise at 6 a.m. until sunset at 6 p.m. with a break for a midday meal. Panama is near the equator, so daylight is approximately 12 hours. Some of the men from Cork sent a complaint to the British consul in Panama about being rooted out of their beds at 4:30 in the morning. But that was because they had to have breakfast and then get to wherever they were working by 6 a.m. when daylight broke. The consul didn't pay very much attention to their complaint. The men worked 6 days per week, Sunday being their only day off. It's hard for us to imagine just how tough this job must have been for men working long hours under a tropical sun, worn out by high temperatures and energy-sapping humidity. Some of the men complained it was like working in a steam bath. They had no modern mechanical aids to help them. Almost all the work had to be done by hand. They did have mules and horses, and they had steam-operated pile drivers to sink the piles into the swamps, and also steam-operated launches on the Chagres River, and of course, steam engines once the tracks were laid to move stuff up and down the tracks. At first, the workers had no proper accommodation. They slept in the holds of 2 old ships, 2 hulks that were anchored just off Manzanillo Island. And that wasn't very pleasant. They were eaten alive by flies and mosquitoes. They then later moved into tents once the island was cleared and the tracks started to move inland. And then the tents were gradually replaced by wooden shacks or shanties, which were usually built on stilts. So we can have a look now at a drawing of one of these. The first shanty built up above the swamps. I imagine most of these shanties were a little bit bigger than the one shown here. Most of the food needed to feed the men had to be shipped in from New York. Panama really was not self-sufficient in agricultural terms. No alcohol was permitted to be sold or consumed on company property, and the railroad went to considerable lengths to enforce this ban. The company saw no need to provide recreational or leisure facilities for its workers. After all, they were working pretty much during daylight hours, and they had only 1 day a week off. At night time, they would just have to rely on lanterns or candles. And one writer said that the mosquitoes were so thick that they would put out the flames of a candle. There were so many of them. In the 1850s, Panama had only one public hospital, which was located in the capital, on the other side of the isthmus from where work on the railroad had started. So there were no medical facilities at all on the Caribbean side, and this forced the company to provide its own facilities for its workers. These facilities were staffed by physicians and surgeons from the US. The provision of medical care in the company's hospitals was costly, however, particularly if men had to remain there for any length of time because of disease or sickness. The railroad found that it was cheaper in many cases to send sick men back home rather than keep them in hospital in Panama. So if they got sick before the end of their, badly sick before the end of their 6-month period, they were shipped home. For this reason, the company repatriated large numbers of sick men back to their places of origin before the end of their contract period. And once back home, they had to fend for themselves. And a proportion of these invalids would have died on the voyage home or not long after their return. The company's policy of dismissing sick men seems heartless to us today. We need, though, to judge the company by the standards of the 1850s, when conditions for workers were well, often non-existent. And same applied to a lot of the railroad workers building working in Britain at the time as well. Their facilities were very, very limited. What happened to the men who built the railway? What was their mortality rate? Well, the number of deaths amongst the railroad's employees is a controversial subject, with estimates ranging all the way from a few hundred to tens of thousands. The railroad company claimed that only 293 white workers had died by 1855, a figure which is quite implausible. The company remained quiet about deaths in other ethnic groups, and no comprehensive record of the number of men who died has survived. The civil authorities in Panama didn't keep death records at this time, and so we don't have an independent source of statistics on mortality in Panama for the 1850s. Panama was clearly an unhealthy location, particularly for white outsiders. Malaria was endemic. Cholera, dysentery, smallpox, typhoid, yellow fever, and other diseases were also prevalent. Sunstroke was another danger for men laboring under an equatorial sun. On the other hand, a contract to work for 6 months in Panama was not an automatic death sentence. This is evident from newspaper reports of large numbers of men returning to their homes at the end of their contracts, and to the fact that some employees volunteered to go back for a second or third time, something they were quite unlikely to do if they thought they were facing a death sentence. How then are we to arrive at a mortality rate for the railroad workers? Well, I believe that the railroad's workforce suffered much the same mortality rate as the men who unsuccessfully attempted to build the French canal across Panama 30 years later. Jump ahead a little bit now, because in the 1880s, a French company under Ferdinand de Lesseps, the builder of the Suez Canal, tried and failed to build a canal across Panama. I've calculated the French canal death rate at about 24%. And there are good grounds for arguing that the railroad's workforce suffered a similar mortality rate. Now, assuming this 24% death rate is reasonably correct, it wouldn't have applied uniformly to all of the railroad's employees, but would have varied among the different ethnic groups. Men coming from the tropical environments of New Granada, Jamaica, and Asia had probably acquired some resistance to malaria and yellow fever prior to their arrival in Panama. This would have given them a lower mortality rate, possibly around 16%. The death rate of white workers with unprepared immune systems would have been higher, and it could have ranged from, say, 28% for those coming from the US to possibly as high as 33% for those Irishmen who came directly from Cork. Now, Chinese workers were the exception, and they experienced a horrendous death rate of close to 80%. That's 80 out of every 100. It's likely that addiction to opium, together with other factors specific to the Chinese, played a key role in their high death toll. It's not clear why so many Chinese died, but it seems that many of them were heavily addicted to opium, and that may explain it. If my estimate of an overall 24% mortality rate is correct, it means that somewhere in the region of 4,200 men died building this short railroad, less than 50 miles long. Now, I'll finish off by saying, what happened after construction was finished? Well, trips between the east and west coasts of the US now became faster, taking 3 to 4 weeks instead of 6 or more weeks previously required. Conditions for travelers crossing Panama greatly improved. Travelers left a ship on one ocean in the morning, got on a train, and were aboard another ship on the opposite ocean by nightfall. They no longer had to worry about falling victims to tropical fevers or of being attacked by bandits on their way across Panama. The establishment of the port of Aspinwall on Panama's Caribbean coast was another success story for the railroad. The port was called after the founder of the railroad, Aspinwall. What had been a swampy mangrove-covered island, barely above sea level, grew into Panama's second most important city. The port, initially called Aspinwall, has been known as Colón since the 1890s, and it's Panama's second city. Today, the railroad, now known as the Panama Canal Railroad, continues to operate coast-to-coast passenger and freight services almost 170 years after its opening. We'll have a look at a picture of the tracks going through the jungle. So the next slide. Yeah, this is a picture of the railroad today. The glory for completing the railroad went to its founders and engineers. The thousands of men of different nationalities, religions, and languages who built the line, often at the cost of their health and frequently their lives, have been ignored and largely forgotten. To my knowledge, no monument marks their achievement. Many of these men are buried in Mount Hope Cemetery near Colón. This neglected burial ground, with its many white crosses rotting under a tropical sun, is a melancholy sight. I hope I've been able to convey to you a little about the history of this unique railroad and to make the story of the men who built it more widely known. If you go to Panama, make sure to take the 1 hour train trip. Now it just takes an hour. That will take you from the Pacific to the Atlantic or vice versa. Panama is also a fascinating country to visit. You'll find more information on the railway in my book called The Panama Railroad, published by Indiana University Press. It's available online and at most good bookshops for 35 to 40 pounds or dollar equivalent. I think Edward will show you a picture of it, or he did have one in a minute. I'd like to thank Edward for giving me this opportunity to speak to you and to thank all of you for listening. And I'll now hand you back to Edward. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much. Gosh, how fascinating. So such a lot to take in. Really amazing. We've got a couple of questions for you, Peter, that have cropped up in the chat.
Okay.
That, if you don't mind, I'll put to you. The first one, Wilfred de Freitas asked, why did they choose to build the Caribbean terminal on Manzanillo Island rather than on the mainland?
Well, the number of reasons. It's not terribly clear why they did it, but one reason was the railroad had another opponent, a man called George Law, who was of Irish origin, and apparently he bought up a lot of the land. Well, this is, I haven't been able to prove this or verify it. He bought up a lot of the land around Portobello, which is a port, a nearby port and town, and then offered to sell the land to the railroad company, but at a greatly inflated price. In other words, he was blackmailing them. The other reason, so that may have influenced them. The other reason was that the New Granada government, as a way of encouraging the railroad, gave them huge tracts of public land that was uninhabited or underexploited land for free. And part of the stretch they gave them was it began at Manzanillo Island. Now the island, yes, the other reason why they would have picked the island was the waters around the island were quite deep, and so they were ideal for a port. The other port, well, Portobello was another port, but then possibly George Law had cornered all the land there. And the other port where ships came in was Chagres, but that was an open roadstead. The ships couldn't come in close to shore. People and goods had to be transshipped onto smaller boats. So I think Manzanillo Island had deep waters. It was relatively sheltered. It was close to the mainland. They built a causeway fairly quickly to take the trains or the track across. And it was free. They didn't have to buy it.
Yeah, amazing. Emma, I'm going to skip over your question about where the workers came from, because I think you asked it just before Peter told us all about their origins. Simon Noble asked you, Peter, did they have the engines and coaches ready when they finished the track?
Yeah, well, they had the engines from about late 1851. They started landing engines when once they had a few miles of track. They began bringing in engines and what they called flat cars or platform cars. Just, I suppose we'd call them wagons. Then towards the end of 1852, a couple of ships tried to land at Chagres, bringing down two big American ships, bringing down over 1,000 passengers, tried to land at Chagres, but the weather was bad. As I said, there was no proper port there. A number of people were drowned trying to get ashore in small boats. So then they moved around to Manzanillo Island, where they were constructing, or they had constructed some wharves by this stage, or docks. So the men, they got off the ships there and they saw the railroad tracks and demanded to be allowed ride in the trains. But the tracks at this stage only went for about eight or maybe 10 miles. This was towards the end of 1852, very end of 1852. And the policy of the railroad up to then had been not to encourage any passengers until they had completed much more of the line. And in fact, they had no passenger carriages. But the men insisted, and there was no way of stopping 1,000 heavily armed gold seekers. So they piled on the trains. And the railroad company decided to discourage as much as possible the use of passengers by charging exorbitant fares or rates, but they were quite happy to pay these. So they rode for the first 8 or 10 miles, and then they had to transfer to boats up the Chagres River. But from then on, the railroad realized that it was, it was onto a good thing, and they started bringing people, as the line stretched further inland, they brought people further and further up, so that the journeys they had to make by river got shorter and shorter. And that brought in a very valuable source of income for the railroad, which helped it to continue its work.
Fantastic. And here's another railway related one. David asked, in your final photograph, we just saw one track. In fact, in the front cover of your book, we just see one track. Has there only ever been a single track between the two oceans?
Well, initially there was only a single track, but they had a number of passing places, about 4 of them, so that trains coming in opposite directions would be able to pull into a siding and let the other train go by. Then during the later on, when they started building the canal, they double-tracked the railroad. But now it's mainly single track, again with sidings or passing places. And I'm going to say something else, and I've forgotten what it was there. It's single track. Oh yes, what I was going to say, the original track, much of the original track is now below the waters of Gatun Lake, because when they were making the canal, they needed a huge reservoir of water to fill the locks, the canal locks. So they flooded a lot of central Panama. It's now known as Gatun Lake. And so the tracks, much of the tracks of the train today are not the original tracks. They're on higher ground. The original tracks are below the waters of the canal or the lake.
Oh, fascinating. And Sally has asked, and I think we might make this the final question, because I'm aware we're taking up a lot of your time, Peter.
No?
And it might be getting close to Bruno's tea time.
He is here. He sound asleep. He wasn't in the least interested.
Sally asked, was the project a success for Aspinwall's company?
Oh yes, it was an enormous success, because from 1855 to 1869, the railroad really had no competitor. Well, I should say, what happened? You might say, well, what happened to the Nicaragua project? Well, Nicaragua really went out of the picture. Vanderbilt's system, because civil war broke out in Nicaragua in the 1850s, and that really destroyed the reputation of Nicaragua as a safe crossing place. And also, once the trains began to run, it was the Panama route became quite rapid. Pretty quickly, you could travel from east to west via Panama in about 3 weeks. So from 1855, when the train was finished, to 1869, which is when the first transcontinental train across the United States was completed, the Panama Railroad had a virtual monopoly of rail transport between the east and west, and also between Europe and the Pacific. So the shares rose to, at one point, became the highest quoted shares on the New York Stock Exchange. And one writer commented that if many of the miners and the gold seekers had, instead of investing all their money and going to California on a fruitless quest in most cases to get looking for gold, if they bought shares in the Panama Railroad Company, they'd have done much better, because shares increased in value enormously. And the company, I think it was between about the 1850s and 1900, it cleared something like $38 million in profits. So it did very well, but it subsequently declined once the canal was built. The railroad was neglected to a large extent, but today it's back in business and it's doing very well because it's now transferring freight freight containers between the two oceans. So really big ships can't get through the Panama Canal, or if they do go through, it costs them a lot of money. So in some cases, it's quicker. They can offload their containers at one end, put them onto flat cars. They double stack them, 2 containers high, and 4 hours later, they can be at the other end of the canal and being loaded onto a ship on the other ocean. So it saves ships going through the canal, and also the really big super Panamax, I think they call them, the huge ships, like the one we saw stuck in the Suez Canal. They can't get through the locks of the Panama Canal. So the railroad now sort of is operating as the land bridge between the two oceans, and is doing very well.
Fascinating. Well, we could go on all evening, couldn't we? I was going to ask you all sorts of questions about the canal side of things, but we have to stop somewhere. So I think that's a great place to stop. Peter, thanks so much. There was one takeaway I had for everyone, because your early map reminded me of one of my favourite pub quiz questions, which everyone here now will know the answer to. Well, you can phrase it various ways, but how about, what is the name of the body of water at the westernmost end of the Panama Railroad? Yeah, and of course it's not what everyone expects. Now, just for everyone else, so you know, I'm trying to twist Peter's arm to come and show us the Panama Railroad one day.
Yeah.
So watch this space. He hasn't said no yet.
Take us for a ride on it. That would be better.
Which of course is a riding up and down. But mind you, taking 4 hours to get from one side to the other, it does tell you something about how slowly it goes. Peter, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I can't thank you enough. And it would be wonderful if anyone would like to unmute themselves and show their appreciation. Thank you very much.
So much.
Peter, thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant.